So we're going to start with that demand side then, or the supply side of the companies and the researchers and innovators who develop the technologies. We'll keep the introductions short. So there's full introductions in your folders, but our speaker is George Poste, who is, I can summarize him. When my wife and I were interviewing here to come here, we had dinner with George, and that was decisive in us coming here. My wife refers to George as the most interesting man in the world. Das Equities guy doesn't stand a chance. But George has a distinguished career, both being in industry and now in academia, and he's going to give the suppliers the technology development perspective. George.
Well, again, thank you very much for the invitation to participate. In common with many in biomedicine, I suffer from a terrible affliction called PowerPointitis, and these will come fairly quickly, but the last slide will actually show you how if you want to go back and reflect on the slides, that they'll be available on the Complex Adaptive Systems website. My paraphrasing of the debate from this morning is this, a comment first made by Alan Garber while he was at Stanford before he became the provost at Harvard. He referred to healthcare as an expensive menu without prices. And I suppose if you look at the Stephen Brill article that just came out, that illustrates just how chaotic the absence of conventional market structure is. As we've heard, clearly it is people like myself, the baby boomers, about to fall apart in a more dramatic way than we have hitherto, are going to basically exacerbate the challenge of infinite demand versus finite resource. And then we have the ultimate economic perversity of simply the do more, bill more system versus managing individual risk and the implication of that for the ability to control healthcare outcomes and cost control. And this is a critical imperative. It's an imperative for society in terms of our sustained economic viability, and for each of us at the selfish level of individuals, it is the maximizing of our wellness. Of course, in the context of technology, the issue is technology merely additive cost, or can you actually demonstrate that the assimilation and adoption of that technology will lead to superior health outcomes and cost effectiveness? And with apologies to my friends from the economy sphere, I would just simply link that as direct and indirect costs. So direct is simply the cost of the technology per se, including linking that to the R&D costs needed to develop that in the first place. And the indirect costs then are not just the cost of the product, whether it be drug, device, or diagnostic, the indirect costs for care, and then the indirect costs, which we hope are largely benefits for society at large. But the challenge, risk of stating the obvious to this audience, is that we are in an era of technology acceleration, but I would argue that the challenge is greater than just managing acceleration in one technological domain. We are now having to look at the cross-sector convergence between medicine, engineering, computing, device technology in the broad domain of mHealth or mobile health, and the ubiquitous presence of social media in all things affecting not only R&D, clinical trials, the delivery of healthcare, but the fundamental issue is the fact that we are having to confront a quite profound asynchrony between the pace at which technology is moving and the ability, particularly of the regulatory and reimbursement systems, to respond to that technological momentum and to translate it into clinical practice. And the old adage in medicine, if it isn't billable, it won't happen, applies. That's why it's crucially important that we have a cogent reimbursement policy for new technologies. But at the same time, there is a profound and growing gap in medical education in terms of the ability to both understand and adopt these technologies, even if reimbursement was right. So one could argue, with apologies for the alliteration, that medical progress has had three major epochs. Some would argue we're still largely trapped in superstition, but I'm at least generous enough to say that most medicine is at least now firmly embedded in the symptomatic era. But in the molecular world, we're moving increasingly to understand what are the molecular signatures that give rise to the symptomatology that the clinician sees. And so that is the world of so-called personalized medicine, which I think is still quite a long way off. Many physicians would argue they do that already, but I'm dealing with this in the more conventional and contemporary sense of the molecular profiling of disease, but I'm using the term precision medicine. So if we start with the genome, the code that dictates the structure and function of the 214 different cell types that make up the 37 organs in our body, and then everything that comes from that informational code, the proteins which are coded for it, and the last wiki search, I think, gave rise to over 400 omics in their various iterations, which I won't bore you with, but it's how does that genetic information become the wiring diagram, the molecular pathways and networks that sit in each of those specialized cell types in our body, and then what goes wrong in disease. But equally important, the last bottom line there is the fact that what is the signature of that disease in any given patient, because patients with a seemingly shared symptomatology who will be diagnosed as having the same disease may in fact have that arising by entirely different alterations in the wiring diagrams of the cells. And we have some notable examples of that, how these biomarkers or signatures have in fact translated to clinical benefit. One, the first in this category, was the development of a drug called Herceptin, followed by a successor, Perjeta, for women who are HER2 positive for breast cancer, EML4, ALK for lung cancer, but I'll come back to this later because that's only 4% of lung cancer patients will actually carry that mutation. Everyone else who received that drug will be a non-responder. So you have 4% responder, 96% non-responder. KRAS for colorectal carcinoma. If you carry a mutation in that particular gene, you will not respond to those two drugs, and that represents about 20% of all colon carcinoma patients. Recently, the introduction for melanoma, Zelboraf, if patients with this have to be profiled for that mutation, and then in an entirely different realm for cystic fibrosis, only children with that particular G551 mutation will respond to that drug. So this is precision diagnostics leading to precision therapeutics. So those are the early success stories, but I'll get back to some challenges later. So precision medicine is mapping the molecular basis of the disease. It is a powerful technology vector because it is the intellectual foundation for increasing diagnostic precision. Diagnostic precision and subtyping of disease should then lead to rational treatment selection, which mitigates risk to the healthcare system, risk to the individual. But what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about is the emerging conflict and contrast between designing therapeutic drugs on the basis of those molecular subtypes versus the diagnostic technologies you use. We talk about companion diagnostics. So if we go back here, we talk about KRAS profiling being a companion diagnostic. We really need to turn it on its head. It's companion therapeutics. The diagnostics now assume the primacy in the decision as to how you treat. And I'm going to use cancer as the case at hand because I spend a lot of time in this arena. These statistics from the National Cancer Institute make for rather sobering reading. 20 to 40% increase in cases driven by demographics alone, limited anticipated therapeutic improvement before 2020. You can see the numbers there. If there's constant cost and survival, we're talking about a 27% increase in care costs. A 5% cumulative drives a 66% increase to over 200 billion. And I would submit that the opportunity for technology is to begin this subtyping of cancers where this is now the most advanced application of that molecular technology to stratify patients so you have the right drug for the right subtype of patient. And this is the reason why. These are just some of the most recently approved drugs. So this is just the direct cost of the drugs before you then add in all of the additional costs of cancer care and the other indirect costs in terms of societal impact. I could have said it a different way, but Jim Watson, I think, has said it most recently. The National Cancer Institute is an agency that is perpetuating an old cancer establishment, and it did. But the most important thing is the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, should not be approving drugs that have only shown a 3-month survival benefit, because if you go back to these, most of these drugs, as an average, are only extending progression-free survival by 2 to 4 months and no impact on overall survival. And this is going to be a very difficult equation. We heard reference to the NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence in the United Kingdom. They have actually denied most of these drugs to be available for individuals in the National Health Service in the UK. And we're in a rather troubled state in terms of cancer care delivery. Not only have we got the cost of new drugs, but the fundamental issue here at the economic level is that the income of oncologists is now so inextricably linked to this because of the buy and bill provision in how they are reimbursed, namely 106% of the margin from the average wholesale price to the 106% of the cost of the drug. And that's a rather formidable fraction of one's income to give up to then choose lower cost therapy. We are slow in updating our standard of care guidelines, SOC, lack of adherence to those guidelines, and you see various statistics, but let's settle on 10 to 15%, because you see some studies higher, some lower, of individuals who go on to a new therapeutic regimen in the last 2 weeks of their life. It's clinically dubious, it's economic nonsense, but it's most importantly, it's clinically very dubious indeed. And look at the red is the fraction we need to look at. You have Gleevec at the top with the smallest fraction, because it was developed for chronic myelogenous leukemia, now has some implications in GIST tumors in the gastrointestinal tract, and you've got a very good response rate there. But you look at some of the others, the red, tragically, is alarmingly large, and those are just the sales of those drugs in 2011. I haven't got the updated data. So what you have is Avastin, which is a fine drug in all of the black zones where patients respond, are genuine therapeutic advances. That's not my point. My point is that we need the mechanisms to identify the responder versus the non-responder fraction. Because here is the challenge. So on the left there, you see the type of tools that we now use to subtype these tumors on the basis of their genes or their proteins, and then we identify in that molecular wiring diagram where the asterisk is a particular point of intervention with that drug or that diagnostic. So here is an all too typical case. This is in fact a gentleman with disseminated miliary melanoma, put on this drug Zelboraf, and you can see in B, 15 weeks of therapy, a miracle. 23 weeks, only a few weeks later, we're back to square one with disseminated tumors which have an entirely different molecular diagram, because that molecular diagram, the wiring diagram, permits redundancy, and you have a new clone which is totally resistant to the original drug emerge. And so this is the challenge for therapeutics, but it's also the challenge clinically and economically. And I think it's summarized here. This is, I hope you can see the differentiation. If you had this number of patients with colorectal carcinoma, those are the different types of subtypes that we can now identify with or without responses to drugs. And an eminent oncologist, that was the anonymous designation given, the problem with all these tests is soon I'll have nothing I can offer my patients. Now, is that good or bad? It's bad if you are, of course, the patient who is suffering, but should you in fact receive a drug that is not going to do you any good, should society to continue to pay to administer drugs to patients who will not benefit from it? That is the challenge, both economically and ethically. And increasingly, we're coming to characterize tumors of what has been known colloquially as malignant snowflakes. As you know, every snowflake has a unique crystalline structure. What we're beginning to find, rather soberingly, is the fact that every individual cancer has a unique series of genetic alterations, and so you don't need to be an oncologist to just simply look at the distribution of those dots, each one of which is a different patient on the axis, to see all those patients are different. And the red and greens on the other side is, does a patient carry a marker to be responsive to a drug, green, red, a definite resistance marker, or has no marker that we know of relative to therapeutic responsiveness. And I think you can begin to see the increasing clinical complexity that goes with that. So we have this collision between the red circle, which is the role of molecular diagnostics with the acronym MDX, whether it be genomic, proteomic, whole genome sequencing, you can pick your particular analytical technique, but it's segmenting cancer patients into ever smaller cohorts. On the other hand, our guidelines, for the most part, make minimal concession to that understanding of cancer biology because we adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. Then we also then have so-called multi-line therapy. You fail the first, and you go to the second, and you go to the third. And then I've already mentioned the question of the types of clinical return, yet alone quality of life we get from intervention in the last 2 weeks of life. So I would submit that we have these colliding vectors of new molecular diagnostics as the intellectual foundation for rational care, because they subtype diseases. Although I'm talking about cancer today, it applies to others too. And you select your therapy on the presence or absence of a molecular marker in that patient's tumor. It permits you to monitor that patient so that if, as we saw in that tragic case of the tumor coming back, you can actually monitor the emergence of that. And if you have a different drug, apologies, sorry, Gary. And of course, the bottom line here is the fact that we're eliminating futile therapy. Not only the impact on quality of life, but cost to the individual, cost to society. And it also would drive increasingly a focus to not only optimum therapy, but I would also argue that we have to make the decision that if we know that a particular patient's tumor does not contain the relevant markers, then palliative care should be adopted. So we have this conflict between cost-based pricing versus for diagnostics versus uncritical acceptance of RX pricing. It's very difficult. I spent many years in the pharmaceutical industry, but I actually find it difficult to actually justify the cost of those therapeutics. It was stated by one CEO, that's what the market will bear. He's absolutely right in terms of free market principle. But the overall issue is the fact that the development cost to bring those drugs to market is no different than the cost of bringing small molecular weight drugs to market. So we've got, on the one hand, if we do not reimburse on the basis of value, namely if I use a diagnostic test to confirm that giving a drug will have a meaningful outcome, and equally important into that value-based pricing, elimination of that therapy because it won't do the patient any good. If we're not going to face up to that as value-based pricing, it will be a profound barrier to innovation. And at the same time, we have this economics incentive to sustain uncritical pricing and therefore for the companies to continue with the same strategies. Because what we're talking about here is an entire technological shift. All of you have your annual physical, and I apologize to the physicians in the audience for putting it in these terms. We all have our annual physical, and your blood or urine is sent in for a conventional lab test, and you get sodium, potassium, creatinine, urea, etc. Single analytes. These new tests are complex multi-analytes where hundreds or if not thousands of things are being measured simultaneously. So the cost of developing and validating that test is no longer less than $1 million, it's in the 10 to 100 million. It also is appropriately increasing the regulatory scrutiny so that rather than having the traditional tests that only require you to operate under a CLIA provision, increasingly companies will have to submit far more complex regulatory dossiers, including all the way up to a PMA in order to have it. This is not a binary yes-no decision because of the complexity of these tests. Many of them require quite sophisticated computational algorithms to actually say whether a patient should actually get that drug. Put all of that together we're seeing a far more complex environment at the regulatory level, the clinical decision level, and right now, because we reimburse traditional tests on the basis of just the cost of the reagents and the cost to run the test, those didn't require complex R&D to develop them. And unless we begin to incorporate that into the pricing structure, this new dimension of molecular profiling will not take off. If you're in industry, the two most feared phrases are, did not meet the street's expectations. That is the carrion of Wall Street, that if you miss your earnings by a penny, you can be devalued. But if you live in the investigational diagnostics arena, investigational, not medically necessary, is in fact the position that you fear most. We're seeing some catch-up because part of this was the fact that there were no reimbursement codes. Remember the old adage, if it's not billable, it's not reimbursable. And if it's not codable, it's not billable. Those are the two primary overarching principles. We now have a whole series of new codes put forward, kicking in 2013, which I won't bore you with the specifics of per se, that cover many of these tests, except I'll drop you to the last three bullets. No distinction is made in the cost for a test which is developed without FDA oversight and approval, just produced in a local laboratory, albeit under CLIA, and the lack of CMS direction on pricing. They've not yet set the formal pricing for these tests, and they've ducked entirely the issue of dealing with a pricing and reimbursement structure for these more complex tests. So here's an example of at least the price lines being put out by Palmetto. So for Zelboraf for melanoma, which I've already introduced you to, they're proposing a test of $58 now in 2013 versus what was $259 in 2012. For KRAS in cancer, in colorectal cancer, a 75% reduction in cost. And so then, of course, the argument is made these tests could in fact go into reimbursement while you develop more and more evidence that they are effective. There are a number of industry concerns as to whether CMS and FDA are sufficiently coordinated in putting forward these studies, or whether you're going to have to do duplicative studies for both. But in the cancer arena, I run to the bottom, and that is the fact that if this drug or diagnostic is only going to be covered under a SED provision, that is it in fact coercive for patients to participate in those trials if in fact that's the only grounds on which they can receive the therapy. But stated in broader vein, if you look at three of the biggest buckets of healthcare costs we have going forward, again reflecting aging and demographics, cancer, cardiovascular and metabolic disease, and diabetes, the combination of diabetes and obesity, and the degenerative neuropathies such as Alzheimer. If we are actually able to capture cancer before the metastatic horse leaves the stable, the tumor can be excised. That's called cure. If we can in fact subtype the tumor relative to the drug class, that's at least then rational therapy. Diabetes, so that would get a green. Diabetes, undoubtedly we know powerfully that lifestyle changes can influence the progression of that disease, coupled with a reasonable therapeutic armamentarium available today. But I could perhaps under lifestyle changes switch that to red. But the issue, of course, in the neuropathies is the fact that even if you've got a diagnostic staging tool for Alzheimer's but no therapy, which is the reality today, is that in fact of any real value? And then we come, of course, to the fact that this is information. All of this is information. It came up today. What is too much information for the busy doc who's only got 10 to 20 minutes to see their patient? I always like T.S. Eliot's comment, hell is the place where nothing connects. Welcome to healthcare. And then, of course, we look at the $45 billion that has been put in under the high-tech funding initiative for health IT. As we've already heard, not only may it be paralyzing at the level of the frontline healthcare personnel who have to enter material into the records, but for the most part, these systems are merely electronic replication of existing formats of healthcare records, and there's a very limited ability in any of these packages to assimilate these new types of technology, and then you have the interoperability iceberg between different vendors. And of course, when do these complex diagnostics actually get into the medical record? How do they get in? And which physicians actually understand the coding letters of A, T, C, and G, or any given mutational element, and the gap analysis becomes increasingly stark. So in summary, I think we're facing in oncology a very interesting conundrum. We have an uncritical acceptance by payors of the very high price of new therapeutics that are offering marginal gains in progression-free survival and certainly not overall survival. There's been a slow adoption of the medical diagnostic technologies which will subtype patients to give us a much better idea of who will respond to those drugs. But also we talked a lot this morning about incentives or disincentives. Right now we have one of the most perverse incentives of all, and that is the fact that oncologists' income is so intimately and inextricably linked to subscribing high-cost drugs, and we do not yet have a regulatory and reimbursement framework which is adequate for the new technologies. And then if we broaden it, if this was a business school class, to disruptive technologies, what you would argue is the fact that new technologies imposed on an anachronistic business model drive cost up without productivity gains. Disruptive technologies will only succeed if they drive new business models, and I would submit that molecular diagnostics will become a disruptive technology. And again, staying with the standard MBA type course, but now talking about molecular omics profiling as disruptive technology. Disruptive technologies always arise at the margins, and they're unanticipated by market leaders and key opinion leaders. These technologies have been driven by scientists, not by the pathologists or the lab test industry. Physicians are not adopting them because the standard of care guidelines are still anachronistic and need updating. Disruptive technologies emerge at the margins of existing fields. Molecular diagnostics and sequencing are coming into these fields from the outside, not being generated from within. And disruptive technologies typically occur when you have multiple fields converging. And what we're seeing here is these tests are only possible because of the combination of molecular biology, engineering, and computing. And then there are other debates which would be a full symposium in their own right on mobile devices and remote monitoring. But the overall issue is the fact that disruptive technologies occur when there are new value propositions or there are existential threats. And I would argue that this is probably the most powerful driver here. One, as we've heard, healthcare costs are unsustainable. At least in oncology, we cannot continue to go on with the one-size-fits-all model without stratifying our patients into subsets. And at some point, payors, and I would argue more importantly, patients, as we see more and more patient advocacy emerge in this area, they in turn will demand greater value, at least in the oncology sphere, for improved efficacy and outcomes. So for those of you who are visiting Arizona, we're delighted to have you here. This is a splendid part of the world, and the purpose of showing this is the fact that the slides I've shown today, together with others on related topics, are available at this website. Gary, thanks for the invitation.